I'm Sam Stephenson, and you're watching Time to Connect.
Sam Stephenson, how you doing, man?
I'm doing very well, John. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, thank you very much for taking the time to connect. We've met, but are just now getting to know each other and looking forward to this conversation. You are an extremely fascinating guy, man. You very far-ranging writer, I guess we would say for sure. We have so much to talk about today. One thing I definitely want to talk about is this amazing project here that is took a pretty sizable chunk of your life. I know
Yeah.
20 plus years, and so many other things. I mean, you've written about photographers, jazz greats such as Bill Evans, Coltrane, Monk, singer-songwriters, Jason Molina, Lucinda Williams, poets, Tennessee Williams, Jane's Addiction. Why this variety? I'm just curious. Let me ask you up front. What is it that has driven you to have such a variety of topics?
Oh gosh. You know, the writer John McPhee, who is still around,
Yep.
I guess is still writing. I think he's in his 80s, wrote for the New Yorker for 50 or 60 years. A few years ago, he published a piece in which he said that he looked back over his career and he looked at everything he'd ever done, and he had a list of every book, every essay, every piece he'd ever written, and he made a check mark beside every one that had roots uh, in his life before he went to college, and it was 90% of the pieces. And I think that same is for me. I mean, I think everything, I was a radio was one of the first things I asked for Christmas when I was old enough to ask for something. Uh, my parents told me, and I remember that radio very well. It was in my room and then in the bathroom for decades. Um, and I loved sound. I loved radio. I loved records. Um, the thing is I'm very quick to say I'm not a music writer, because whenever I'm around a music writer, I have some very close friends who are legitimate music critics. They know so much more than I do, and so do the musicians. So I'm really just sort of wandering around looking for human stories, and it just so happens a lot of them end up being musicians. But I did the jazz project for so long. I became somewhat known in the jazz world for doing researching obscure musicians. I think was kind of my forte, like not really the icons.
Mhm.
Although I have, as you mentioned, a couple of them, uh, Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane, I've written about, but I've tried to find non-iconographic ways to write about them, and then when I switched over to Jane's Addiction, there were definitely some jazz um, heads who were baffled.
Mhm.
Uh,
Yeah.
but I don't know. I just sort of find footing in a project, and whenever there's footing, quite honestly, it often means can I raise money, to do it and get some financing. Uh, that's part of the formula. It's not all of it by any means, but I've had to make some decisions based on what I can get paid to do.
Mhm.
Um, but
Excuse me, man.
yeah,
Yeah, I think that's probably one of the secrets to your success is that you haven't stayed in your lane, and that maybe you don't write in the way of a music critic. You are somewhat unique. In fact, your style has been called lyric research. I guess your documentary and writing style. The poet Roske called it lyric research. Uh,
that's right.
and you are somewhat unique. I know we talked about you reading something early on here from your forthcoming book on Bill Evans, but before you do that, let me just ask you, what do you suppose, this is a tough question. So if you want to defer, that's fine. But what do you suppose, other than, you've mentioned to me that you've had a lot of luck. You've been very lucky to get a lot of grants and fellowships, and of course, luck always plays some part in it. I suppose even Meryl Streep had luck. But other than luck, without being modest, what is it about you that has made you successful?
Oh gosh, maybe the ability to write a letter. Um, you Before email, I used to write people letters like heroes. Um, and uh, and I and I still do that. In fact, just day before yesterday, can you see this cover?
Yes.
Um, The Gallery of Clouds by Rachel Eisendrath. I just love this book, and this is really lyric research. I mean, I think almost all of her research is in libraries, which I love. Libraries are one of my favorite places where I feel at home.
Mhm.
Archives, and I wrote her an email on Monday or Tuesday. Googled her, found her email address at Barnard at Columbia, New York, and just wrote her and told her how much her book had impacted me and what I liked about it, her rhythms and her word choices, and she just responded this morning. I hope she doesn't mind me saying this. Uh, was a really kind. She really appreciated it very much. And I think uh, in some ways that's my secret because I have been lucky with grants, but grants require a lot of writing. Um, and So here's one thing that actually Ross Gay and I talk about quite a bit in talking about lyric research is um, the thing about lyric research is you don't know where you're going. You're going to find something. You're going to learn that what you thought was going to happen is wrong, and you have to change your mind. That's a really critical part of lyric research.
Mhm.
And I do think there's a talent in because the thing is the world at large, the culture out there at large wants you to know where you're going, especially uh, you know, especially people that care about what's going on, like
Yeah.
even like your parents, your family. They want to make sure everything's okay. Want to make sure you're going, you know, in a place that's good, and that is 100% valid. But the truth is, you often don't know, and the truthful answer is I don't know. And and when you're writing a grant proposal, especially big ones, um, for big money, the funder very, very rightly and understandably wants to know where you're going.
Mhm.
But the thing is if you write that before you do the work, you really don't have any idea where you're going.
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
you have to be able to write that convincingly. You have to be able to win people's trust and it be able to be okay if you change your mind. Now, I can tell you that in my career, especially when I worked at university, changing your mind in a university with is difficult. It's seen as I mean, I think science is different in a way because that's part of the scientific process is you learn that something works or doesn't work. But in the arts and in the humanities, um, you can bump into some problems. But I've been successful being honest, just be honest. I'm not sure exactly where this is going, but I'm gonna be rigorous as I can be about it.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that maybe I have some skill in that. Where I got that skill, I have no idea.
Clearly, you do. You also have a lot of determination. I mean, what I know about this, Eugene Smith book, man, that took one hell of a lot of determination, stick-to-itiveness, dedication. It took a really long time to do that thing, and you probably went down a lot of rabbit holes that weren't fruitful, and it was a lot of hard work, man.
Definitely. Yeah, that's for sure. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. I mean, the book, I don't have the book, but the book Gene Smith Sync, which I have in here somewhere.
Here we go. Here we go, man.
No, well, that's the Jazz Loft Project.
Oh, right. That's
yeah,
true.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
that
right.
one, you can look at that one.
Yeah.
And it's clear how much work there went into it.
Yeah.
Because it's a big book, and but the Gene Smith Sync is more like this book, where
Right.
I guarantee you it took her, I don't know, I'm gonna ask her this, but I guarantee it took her at least 10 years to write this little book.
Yeah.
But the depth of research and thinking that she did,
Yeah.
and then the choice of words, and condensing it down to only the most bare sort of choice of words. I feel sure that's what her process was. But thanks for saying that. I appreciate it.
You bet. You were talking about changing course can be difficult in academia. I can tell you that I pissed off my my PhD dissertation advisor so many times because I kept changing horses. But that's been something one of the reasons I think you and I are probably, birds of a feather in some ways, is that I love variety, man. I love exploring different things, and I don't want to stay in my lane, Well,
Yeah.
cool. We talked about you reading from your forthcoming book on the amazing, my favorite piano player of all time, Bill Evans. You mentioned that this would kind of be a nice introduction to you as well. So you mind
there's
doing that?
kind of a this is from what will be in the book. It's somewhere. It could be the introduction, it could be the end, actually. Or can you hear that? There's somebody out there with a leaf blower. Is that coming through? Okay. But this is kind of an introductory material. I've called this book B minor waltz for Elaine. Bill Evans and Elaine Schultz Evans, 1961 and 1973. B minor waltz for Elaine was a tune that he composed for her. They were married, or maybe not married, but they called themselves married. So they were effectively married for 13 years. And I'll just start. This will take just 5 minutes or so. Among bits of news in the ad lib column of the April 23rd, 1964 issue of Downbeat magazine, there are these 2 lines. Pianist Bill Evans has been vacationing at his parents' Florida home. It is reported that Evans has gained 25 pounds. And that's all it said. These 20 words contain a world. Evans, a legendary jazz pianist, was a heroin addict visiting his parents, retired from a blue-collar life in New Jersey to a clapboard cottage in Ormond Beach, Florida. In an effort to kick his habit, he was overeating, or maybe finally eating properly, and enjoying home cooking a block from the beach. His wife, Elaine Schultz Evans, was with him. She too had a heroin habit to kick. While staying in Ormond Beach for several months that year, 1964, Elaine became somewhat famous for her role in the civil rights movement in nearby St. Augustine, a locus of protesting in the buildup to the congressional voting on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Elaine was one of 5 whites and 35 blacks to participate in a wade-in of segregated waters in St. Augustine. She was almost drowned. She was beaten by white supremacists and almost drowned, and wore a splint over her nose for several weeks. And then it goes on to say a couple of things that I can't really reveal yet. There's a couple of bombshells about this that my publisher would be mad if I revealed. but you get the point. She was deeply involved in the civil rights movement in St. Augustine, in the wade-ins of segregated water, which is something different than sit-ins at restaurants and things like that. I was born in 1966 and raised in Washington, North Carolina, a town of 9,700 people on the brackish Pamlico River near the coast. The year I was born, my parents bought a 1,000 square foot unair conditioned cottage literally next door to a black beach, Griffin's Beach, both of which sat 6 miles down the brackish river from downtown Washington. We lived in the cottage from May until September every year. When we went swimming in front of our house, often there would be several dozen, if not more than 100 black swimmers nearby. Just a few yards, really, but two different worlds, maybe 150 meters apart at most. My parents kept the cottage until 1995. I have clear memories of going to sleep on hot, humid weekend nights in the dead of summer in the 1970s and early 80s, windows wide open, desperate for a breeze, listening to the party music over at Griffin's. Earth, Wind and Fire, Kool and the Gang, Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, the Commodores, sometimes harder stuff like Funkadelic, Sly and the Family Stone, Cordis Mayfield. Then years later, it was Run DMC, Grandmaster Flash, Prince, and Michael Jackson. Washington was about 50-50 black and white. Today, it's 47% white, 45% black, and 6% Latino. My father, a physician, was the chair of the Washington City School Board that oversaw integration in the late 60s and early 70s. He and my mother were staunch supporters of the integrated public schools. Many white families pulled their kids out of public schools and sent them to newly opened private schools. My two older brothers can remember integration. I came later and was part of the innocent generation of, quote, integration honeymooners, unquote, that knew nothing different than the way it was, integrated, half white, half black student bodies. When I went to college at UNC Chapel Hill, I was sincerely surprised at the segregation on campus. After college, I worked for the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C., that researches policies impacting low-income families. Then I worked for a liberal member of the House Ways and Means Committee from Milwaukee. Thinking about social and political issues has been part of my life and work from the start. I'm not overtly political in my writing. The renowned filmmaker Jim Cohen once said, after reading a piece on John Coltrane's first biographer, who was a black physician, that I wrote for the Paris Review, Jim said, "You've taken your subliminal subversion to an even higher level." Jazz is also in my blood. My father played trumpet, and I grew up hearing big band jazz on our home stereo every Saturday night. I called it steak cooking music because my dad grilled steaks every Saturday night. Then for 20 years, my work included heavy doses of jazz research, resulting in 2 books, The Jazz Loft Project and Gene Smith Sync, both of which feature famous jazz musicians like Thelonious Monk and Bill Evans, but many more obscure ones, including Unknown Women. I'm drawn to the stories that are hidden by history. Sometimes I call myself a story finder rather than a storyteller. This book is not a memoir, but this personal backstory is important. It indicates why the ad lib item at the top of this introduction lured me into this project. The clip about Bill Evans in Florida gaining weight in Downbeat magazine was texted to me by my next door neighbor in Bloomington, Indiana, David Brent Johnson, who is a jazz documentarian and on-air host at the local NPR station, WFIU. He sent it to me when he found it skimming old issues of Downbeat at the library. He knew I'd be curious about it. He thought the part about weight gain in a jazz magazine was funny. Now, almost 5 years later, I'm still researching Bill Evans, Elaine Schultz in Florida. It all started with that clip that David texted me. As I began researching the power and agony of Elaine's story in general, and her surprising role in the civil rights movement in particular, began driving my project. Bill's story has been told many times. He's one of the most written about jazz pianists in history. Elaine's story has never been told. This book is in many ways about her, her tortured youth in the Bronx, her brilliant tendencies, and more. I think I'll just stop there.
Nice, man. I'm definitely looking forward to this book. What do you have any idea when this thing will be available? How far along are you? Where are you in the process?
Well, I'm actually already behind my original deadline by about 2 years. Um, but I think I have a good reasons for that. The pandemic was one. We moved from Bloomington, Indiana to here, College Station, Texas, was another one that was time consuming and distracting. And then I got a job ghostwriting the memoir of Lucinda Williams, the musician. And I think, everybody understood that I couldn't pass that up. So it was a
Right.
dream job.
How did
So,
that come about?
well, so this is another one of my letter writing things. I guess I started working with Lucinda in 2020, maybe a little bit, maybe late 19. Um, and about 10 years before that, I'd read an article about her, and she was always one of my real idols. I mean, I just thought she was wonderful and very smart. Um, and but I read an article about her around 2010, 2009, where she said that uh, she and her husband and her team had countless hours of concert footage of her that they didn't know what to do with. And I just thought, well, I know what to do with it. I can help with that. So I wrote her a letter. I got her email address from the musician Joe Henry, mutual friend, and I wrote her an email and just kind of said who I was. By that time, the Jazz Loft project was out, so I think I sent her a copy of that, and just said, if you need a brainstormer for what to do with that footage, you know, I'm I just finished this project and I'm looking to do something else. So I stayed in touch with her. Her husband responded to my email, Tom Overby, and we just stayed in touch over the years. And when she started working on the book, she started realizing it was more difficult than she and her editor had thought, and they needed somebody to help. So I came in and did over 100 hours of interviews with her, and also used 100 hours or so of interviews that her husband had done with her. So that was the basis of that book.
Nice. I read that book before I knew who you were and really enjoyed it, by the way. And she's colossal, man. She's very unique and um, such an interesting combination of things, comes out of a family where her dad was I guess, was he the poet laureate of Mississippi? Is that right?
Well, I can't. No, he spent most of his. Well, he moved around, but he did. Well, probably what you're thinking of is he was the inaugural poet for Bill Clinton's second inauguration.
Okay.
Because he spent most of his teaching career in Arkansas, so that's how
Uh-huh.
he knew Clinton.
Remind me, and it's been a while since I've read that book. Did you get much? Did you and her get much into kind of the infamous difficult recording process of Car Wheels on a Gravel Road, that
Oh
record?
yeah, that's a large part of the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And it's a great record, man, but it's quite a
yeah.
story behind it too, huh?
Yeah, there's a lot of stories. I mean, she was a lot of the stories are wrong. Part of what we
I'm
do is
remembering now. Yeah. And I
yeah,
remember that she handled it pretty well. She got a little defensive in the book, but I think she handled it pretty well because there's a lot of nasty things being said about her at that time.
I know, I know. I mean, part of what she says is, and her attorney, uh, gosh, darn, I'm spacing her attorney's name. Her last name is is Carol. Anyway, her attorney, it's a woman who's been with her for the whole time, like 40 years. And Rosemary Carroll, who was married to Danny Goldberg, and used to be married to Danny Goldberg, uh, and Rosemary told me early on that like 75% of those stories are bullshit, um, and that it took her 7 years to get Car Wheels done.
Yep.
But if you look at Springsteen and Dylan and Neil Young, and there's a lot of gaps that long.
Yeah.
And then sometimes they pump them out.
Right.
And so it's a complicated story.
It
But
is.
also she readily admits that she's involved in absolutely every part of any of her projects, from writing the songs to the album cover art,
Yeah.
but again, there's a lot of others who can say that too.
Right on. And now you're working on something on Jane's addiction.
Uh-huh.
How in the world did that come about? There's
Well,
another
when I
interesting turn
was
in the in the writing of Sam Stephenson.
well, I saw them play in 1990, and uh, and was blown away. And I saw them again in 91. But they were ahead of their time in a lot of ways. Um, but after living in the jazz world for so long, um, I wanted to do something more contemporary, and the Lucinda project satisfied that as well. But the Janes actually came before Lucinda,
Okay.
and I was lucky enough to get a Guggenheim Fellowship for the Jane's Addiction project, and I've had to kind of put that on the back burner for a while. But they were on the front edge of something that I think has been forgotten that they did.
Okay.
Back in the late 80s, that right in the middle, the heart of the AIDS scare, and they were really pushing boundaries of gender on stage,
Okay.
while also playing this very complex mix of punk and metal, um, and um, uh, and funk, and I think that a lot of what they achieved back then, which depending on who you talk to, really what made it possible for Pearl Jam, Nirvana, and them to come right after them, um, has been forgotten. So I kind of wanted to excavate that story, especially the gender part, that in the AIDS scare, and they were really pushing the boundaries of some things that nobody else was really pushing back at that time, or not many people were.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, but maybe in a different way. I'm thinking about Iggy and the New York Dolls and Bowie and
yeah,
maybe a few others who were. I mean, even that whole glam rock thing of the '70s, a lot of that got really kind of weird with gender. But
yeah,
I'm sensing you're saying the way Perry Farrell and Jane's Addiction did it. It's not only the music, but they did it in a different way.
yeah. I mean, they did it with metal. I think and funk and punk.
Uh-huh.
I think Bowie was definitely a big influence, um,
Sure.
for sure. And they weren't the only ones, but I think that what they did, uh I mean, people were scared to go to their shows. I mean they
Really?
people might have been scared to go to Bowie or the Stooges or something. The Stooges were another huge influence on them. And there definitely is possibility that people were the Sex Pistols, and these were all their people doing. I mean, they didn't invent anything. They,
Right.
like, hardly anybody actually invents anything. Everybody's just sort of building on what came before.
Yeah.
So they had all those influ The Velvet Underground were a huge influence on them.
Why were people afraid to go to the Jane's Addiction shows?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the AIDS scare. I mean, there were a lot of rumors that all the members of Jane's had AIDS. and that they were having sex with each other. They wore dresses on stage. Um, they there were just all kinds of rumors. This was before the internet, so
Right.
um, there
Are,
were
are,
rumors
are,
that.
aren't we glad the internet came along to resolve all those bad rumors?
um, there were rumors that Perry Farrell was going to die any day now. I mean, nobody understood AIDS back then. They thought you could
Right.
you could catch it just by being in the same room with somebody.
Uh,
Uh, yeah,
yeah, you're not a political writer, but it's going to be hard not to, in that book, not to get a little bit political when you had a sitting president who refused to even say the word.
exactly. That project is complicated. I actually went down and saw Jane's play in Houston about 3 weeks ago.
Wow.
And it was a great show. It was the first time they had the original lineup back together in about 12 years. And then before that, it was 1991. So they've had the original lineup together hardly at all since 91.
Mhm.
Um, and the bass player is so important, Eric Avery, to their sound. And they sounded great. I mean, the three instrumental musicians, Dave Navarro, Eric Avery on bass, and Stephen Perkins on drums, were unbelievable. Sounded incredible. And Farrell was good. But the thing about Farrell is back in the late 80s up to 91, I mean, he was a bizarre figure. I mean, really kind of a creepy, bizarre kind of shaman type figure.
Mm.
And that's not present anymore. Nobody, there's not, I don't know how you maintain that, um, um, maybe the only way to maintain that kind of image will be to disappear for 40 years, and then come back. But who knows? I don't know.
Yeah.
But even though I got a Guggenheim Fellowship for that, and I've written an article about them, you know, it's a tough one. I have to do some thinking about it when I'm done with Evans about what I'm going to do with that project.
If your decks were cleared and you had no projects going right now, who are some of the folks that you'd love to write about?
Man, that's a good question. Well, yeah, you mean if and so like conveniences were not an issue.
Right. Just, we're doing fantasy here.
Fantasy. Um, One of them is definitely Dean Smith, the basketball coach of University of North Carolina.
Okay.
When I grew up in North Carolina, he was a god, and he had integrated college sports in the entire South, and um, he integrated churches, and I mean, he just did incredible. I mean, he walked on water, and also coached some of the best basketball players that ever played, and so he's somebody I've always been interested in. But that's probably, in order to do that project right, it'd probably be, I think it'd be at least 5 years, probably 10 to do it right. And I don't know if I have that time. I mean, and but other ones, I mean, there's some weird ones that are funny, kind of Neil Diamond. Um, my parents took me to see Neil Diamond in Madison Square Garden when I was a teenager, like a young teen, like mid-teens.
What year would this have been?
This would have been roughly 1980,
Okay.
and um, and maybe a couple years later than that, actually. Now that I think about it, and I didn't really want to go, and I was blown away. I mean, have you ever seen Neil Diamond in concert?
I have not, but I'm significantly older than you. I don't know if significantly. I'm a bit older than you for sure. And I remember when he was cool, man.
Yeah.
I remember Neil Diamond was cool.
Well,
I
he was an unbelievable performer.
Yeah.
I mean, seriously, unbelievable.
Okay.
And so then I came home and did a junior high school project, like a presentation, audio, video, or audio and reading on Neil Diamond. And I
Nice.
still think he's an interesting figure. a very complex figure. I think another one of these figures who has become such an icon. I mean, you remember back when the Rolling Stone used to print the highest grossing concerts uh, every week or every 2 weeks or whatever in the back of the magazine. I mean, Neil would be up there with the Grateful Dead, you know,
Wow.
for highest grossing shows. And so I don't know. Plus, just my love of New York City. You know,
Okay.
that would be a project that would get me back and get me in New York City. Uh, so that's one of them.
For what it's worth, by the way, this is, and you may already sense this. This is obviously anecdotal, and it may just be my bias, but I kind of think of him like Elvis in that sense that he was really cool in the early years, and then there's years where he was, he was still doing good work, but then it became a Vegas act. Sort
Yeah.
of. That's the way I think of him. I don't know if that's fair or not.
Well, I think it probably is not unfair. I mean, I think he was it's hard to turn that off when you start drawing, when you start selling out the garden, you know,
Yeah, yeah, right.
it's hard to turn that off. I mean, I think um some other huge stars that might have suffered from that too. It's like I
You
wish I
bet.
could go back and play clubs where people are standing up again, It's um but they get so popular,
Yeah.
um but anyway, I mean there's tons of other ones. I mean I have a long list of projects, a lot of things I would love to do, and maybe we'll get to one day.
I'm sure you do not suffer from a lack of things that you're interested in. So who are some of the writers who you admire, maybe whether they've influenced you or not? Who have you read throughout the years or and that you feel like is worth mentioning
Well, uh
in any genre?
yeah. Gosh, you know what? I have a document right here that because somebody asked me to come up with a list, and let me see if I
Cool.
can pull that up right quick.
Great.
Um, yes, here it is. Okay, so this is just a partial list, but um, Anne Carson, Decreation, it's a collection of her writings. Susan Howe, Sorting Facts, or 19 Ways of Looking at Chris Marker. Chris Marker was the filmmaker. Tennessee Williams, there are like a number of Tennessee Williams books. The text of his plays along with the stage notes. Um, there's a book called Dr. Johnson and Mr. Savage by Richard Holmes, who's a British biographer. Some more recent things, Terrence Hayes, To Float in the Spaces Between, which is a real interesting biography he wrote of a writer. Joseph Mitchell, Bottom of the Harbor, kind of old school New Yorker magazine writer that I think is really underappreciated today. After a lot of people know who he is, but um, he needs to be rediscovered in a different sort of way. Um, James Agee's book, Agee on Film, something about that. Roberto Rossellini, the filmmaker, also writing about his film methods. Janet Malcolm was huge for me, the New Yorker writer, New York Review of Books, particularly her book, The Silent Woman, about Sylvia Plath, and her book about Freud. Um, and then, yeah, but I have, countless others. Thomas Wolfe, Of Time and the River. I love that book. There's a lot in there. Another writer who's very well known, but I think needs to be rediscovered. Um, but I mean, just I have a lot of different influences: poetry, theater, fiction, nonfiction. Ross Gay, who you mentioned earlier, love his work. Um, um,
Did you ever get
uh,
into Elizabeth Bishop?
Yeah, I like Elizabeth Bishop. Um, Also, gosh, this writer from Houston, Christina Rivera Garza. Um, she is she's fantastic.
Okay.
Um,
Okay. Do you remember how old you were, or what? Is there a moment that you can remember when you said, "I'm going to be a writer. This is going to be my path"?
Man, that was late. I was in my 20s. I was in my mid 20s. Because I had always done well in classes that required writing going back to, grade school. But I didn't recognize that. And I did have one teacher in high school, a brilliant man, English teacher and journalism teacher named James Farrell. He had a bust of William Shakespeare in his in his classroom, and he called him Will. And he was really encouraging to me, but I just didn't know anybody, growing up, who was a writer. And then when I went to UNC, I did really well in classes that required writing, but I did poorly in multiple choice classes. Um, and then I was my career. I worked in corporate banking, and then I worked on Capitol Hill in DC for 3 years. And then I tried grad school in a couple of different realms. And then I was working at a really great bookstore in Raleigh, North Carolina, called Quail Ridge Books. And that's when my writing career really started, because I was reading everything I could find. And there was also a wonderful community there of staffers and customers. That was really when it was where I was like, okay, you know what, I can do this. But I was late. I was 26, 27, um, maybe even 28, before I really had the confidence that I could do this, and other people who thought the same way.
Nice. One question I like to ask people, just it's sort of off topic, but I know music's been very important for you. If you had to choose one concert that you attended that just really blew you away, I know that's really hard. I know you've probably seen a
Yeah.
lot, but what comes to mind?
Well, I mean that Jane's Addiction show in 1990 was one of them.
Yeah.
But more recently, I mean, yeah, I've seen countless great jazz shows.
Yeah.
Branford Marsalis is he's unbelievable. I think his quartet is one of the best working bands in the whole world in any genre. Um, but one show that comes to mind is 2017. My wife and I went to see the David Rawlings Machine
Mhm.
with Gillian Welch.
And
Uh,
John Paul Jones, was he on Mando?
no, no.
When I saw them, he had John Paul Jones on mandolin.
You mean John Paul Jones,
Led
the
Zeppelin,
Zeppelin?
basically. Yeah.
Where? Where did he?
This was in St. Louis, but I can there's videos on YouTube of them playing together.
Huh.
Uh, I'll send you a
Okay.
link to this, but yeah.
Well, no,
Was
I
Willie
just saw
was Willie
the big,
Watson in the band then? Do you know?
yeah, he was, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um I saw I saw them in at a great little venue, a standing venue with some seats in Bloomington, downtown Bloomington, Indiana. And what really hit me so hard about that show was the sound. I mean, and I've heard that Welch and Rawlings really, I think they were touring as the Rawlings Machine. And so most of the songs were Rawlings songs with Gillian Welch singing harmony. But then they did do it for a handful of her kind of patented songs. But I'd heard that they take great care on this about the sound.
Yeah.
And the thing that just was profound to me. The sound was so good that neither one of them had to strain to sing. So it was almost like they were barely even talking,
Mhm.
but they were singing beautifully. but the sound was just so good.
His guitar playing is just exquisite.
Yeah,
It's amazing. As a matter, this is coincidence. I just took a shower this morning and changed clothes and put on this, thinking about you. But I literally had on a David Rawlings Machine T-shirt before this morning before I changed clothes. That's pretty coincidental. Did you ever see at the Vanguard? Did you ever get a chance to see Christian McBride? God dang, man, that guy.
yeah. I've seen him in a number of settings with a number of different bands. Yeah, he's phenomenal. Yeah.
Incredible. Okay,
But
then
we
we got
can
to start.
talk a lot more about jazz if you want to. I mean, I know, uh, yeah, for 20 years that was my thing, and now I
Yeah.
hardly ever talk about it. So it's fun to talk about.
Well,
Um,
maybe we'll have part two of this. I like to keep these interviews relatively short, and I want to hit you with some kind of short answer questions. So
okay,
let's save the deep dive into jazz for maybe part two of this conversation.
okay,
Fair enough.
yeah.
So what are you listening to now?
A lot of I'm listening to Ravel right now, the
Okay.
classical French classical composer, and that's because of the influence of him on Bill Evans.
Okay. You mentioned to me in a text something about a CD, which caught my attention. Although I still have a huge CD collection, I just almost never, ever listen to CDs. And as a singer-songwriter, I have CDs and I bring them to the show sometimes, but it's funny the reaction I get from people. They're saying, I'll buy one just to support you, but I'm never going to listen to it." It seems to be a dying thing. It seems like most people are either listening to their music on vinyl or streaming. And
Right.
I'm just curious if you have thoughts about these formats and what you prefer and where do you think it's going, et cetera.
Well, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that. My car is a 2012 Honda Accord um, that I've had since like 2013, and it has a CD player, and I don't know what I would do without that because I really um, listen to a lot of music driving, um, and I just don't get the same rewards from streaming. But
Right.
I'm always really late to everything. Um, so I could change my mind. I mean, I know my good friend Ben Ratliff, the longtime New York Times writer, who is a really really brilliant thinker. One of the things he has pointed out about streaming is that, and he has a new book coming out about this, or his last book was about this, and his next one is too. Um, is it presents new options like for longer songs,
Yeah.
for more a different type of listening that um, might be really good for like walking, and like his next book is about running, jogging, and listening at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm open to that. My next door neighbor here in College Station is a retired statistics professor, and he goes on 1 hour walks every day. Um, and he has these really nice headphones, really over the ear headphones, and he's a very serious music listener. And he hipped me to Tidal. Do you know that Tidal? It's a streaming
Yes.
service.
Yes.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
you have to.
Somebody I know is on there. Okay. Yeah.
I joined it because of he said you got to join Tidal because um the sound quality is better than Spotify. Yeah, you have to pay more. It's like $20 a month or something like that, or 15. Um, uh,
Bandcamp is another good one.
yeah. Oh, Bandcamp. I love Bandcamp.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not I don't have very strong feelings about it. To me,
Okay.
if people are listening to music, I don't care where it's coming from. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but I do like CDs in the car. But I'm worried. My son, age 9, he likes to say, "Dad, you need a new car," because mine seems really old to him. Um, but I worry about. I don't even know if they put CD players in cars anymore.
They typically don't. They typically don't. Yeah. Speaking of listening, I always am curious about how authors feel about audiobooks. I'll just tell you what I like to do, especially if it's somebody I dearly love, is I like kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like movies that are based on books. I like to read the book first and then listen to it, to have a little more rich experience. And man, it is so important who reads that book. You know, I can
Yeah.
buy a book from Audible and within the first 10 minutes say I'm returning it because I can't listen to this person for 12 hours. But you mentioned in Gene Smith's Sync, you mentioned Will Patton reading Light in August. And man, I would listen to Will Patton read the dictionary. That guy's, what a voice he has.
Totally.
I'm curious, how do you feel about audiobooks in general?
Oh, I like them. I mean, I don't read a lot of them. I don't listen to a lot of them. There's my life is full of. I don't have enough time already. As
Yeah.
with as you know, what it's like with kids. So, um, but but I love audiobooks. And the Will Patton reading Faulkner's Light in August was recommended to me by my buddy Alan Gurganus, the writer. And boy, he was right about it. I mean, just that language, that Faulkner's language and Patton just inhabiting it, it's unreal.
Yeah.
And I think you know how like in a jazz group, you can find a Christian McBride or some player and you can just follow their career no matter what record they're on.
Yeah.
And it's going to be great. It doesn't matter if it's their record or if they're playing on
Right.
someone else's record.
Yeah. Yeah.
Patton is like that with reading. I mean,
I agree.
it doesn't matter what he's reading. I mean, it can be Dennis Johnson or although he
Yeah.
does choose, I think he's picky. He doesn't read just anything, but he
He,
reads Dennis Johnson, all of Dennis Johnson's stuff, and James Lee Burke, the
right. And
and
also Charles Frazier.
oh yeah, right, Cold
Yeah.
Mountain.
Yeah. But there's a book called 13 Moons of
Oh
Charles
yeah,
Frazier's that Patton reads. Is just, man, it's totally captivating.
he's great.
Yeah, man,
Um,
we're almost up to an hour, and I always try to keep these less than an hour. We clearly have to do part two. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of so many things. Let me just ask you a couple of super quick kind of answer questions to take this out. Um, let's see. Cliche as it might be, what advice do you have for young writers?
uh, 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 Two things. One, find content you love and dig into that first. Doesn't matter what it is. Um, it could be absolutely anything. Just find, something you love or deeply intrigued about. Um, and the way that manifests could be any form, poetry, does the right genre will find its way. And then the second thing would be rhythm. And I believe rhythm is the most important thing about writing. And I think this connects to audiobooks. Because you know the older books like Dante's uh Inferno and everything Dante does, the Bible, everything, the ancient Greek stuff, that was all meant to be heard, not read on the page because they didn't have books.
Right.
So and like I've learned a lot about Dante and the percussive qualities of the language that are meant to be read out loud and performed.
Yeah.
And so I think that rhythm is really important to writing, even if it's meant for the page. I mean, and I've started learning. A lot of other writers agree with me on that. That gives me confidence. Like Virginia Woolf was really big on writing. There's some quotes from her in a letter where she's like, "Rhythm is everything," and I'm like, "Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, in that sense, it's very much like songwriting, and
right."
we'll shelve that conversation for part two because I just realized I was hoping you would read something from the Jane's Addiction piece. So
Yeah.
why don't you take us out with a reading from that book, if you
Okay.
don't mind?
I'll just read the beginning of it and then
Okay.
So just a couple minutes. Okay. This piece is called Feeling Nowhere, and it was published in Affidavit magazine in 2019. All right, here's the beginning. Quote, I once fucked Jesse Helms and it was the worst sex I've ever had, unquote. Perry Farrell muttered that line into the microphone on stage midway through a show at the University of North Carolina's Memorial Hall on Tuesday, November 13th, 1990. The frontman of Jane's Addiction, drenched in sweat, his junk hanging out of women's lingerie, shared bong hits with fans in the mosh pit and doused the front rows with red wine. Later, he pulled a small pipe from his boot and shared that too. Farrell was about 5'9", 135 pounds, with shoulder-length black dreads, his body sinewed by drugs and surfing. Farrell had begun the show wearing a long black women's raincoat. He talked often to the audience, which was more diverse than most loud alternative rock shows, with some Black and Latino fans and many women by themselves or in small groups. Amid the sold-out hall were punks, metalheads, hippies, and college kids. There was also a significant LGBT presence. Midterm elections had occurred the previous Tuesday, with the nation watching North Carolina Senate race. Controversial conservative incumbent Jesse Helms beat Harvey Gantt, an African-American mayor of Charlotte, after the latter led polls for most of the race. There were widespread complaints about voter suppression in the form of intimidating postcards mailed by the GOP to predominantly African-American precincts with false warnings about illegal voting. Americans living through essentially the third term of Reagan-Bush. With George H.W. Bush as his vice president, Ronald Reagan slashed taxes in the upper brackets and quadrupled defense spending. Then Bush became president with the help of a notorious ad about Willie Horton, an African-American convict who committed several felonies, including rape, while on furlough. By the time of the Jane's Addiction show, the Bush administration was ramping up war with Iraq over Kuwait, a country smaller than South Carolina. I hadn't thought of Jane's Addiction for nearly 3 decades until last year's midterm elections, which made me remember the 1990 midterms. The stakes seemed epochal then and now. I told a friend, a former college radio DJ who is now a judge, that I was interested in researching the band against the backdrop of the late 80s and early 1990s, how that story may resonate today. And that's the Jane's Project in short.
Right on, man. Right on. Look forward to that. Hey, thank you so much for doing this. Let's definitely do a part 2. Let's stay in touch. Anyone who's listened to this, I do encourage you to dive into Sam's various projects. I'll put a link to your webpage in the show notes here. Anything else you want to say before we call this quits?
Thank you for doing what you're doing, John. I really appreciate it. Some of your interviews have been, I've just learned about them a couple of weeks ago, and man, you're doing some great work, and it's really, really helpful to the culture at large to give people, a little forum, to talk about stuff like, and you're interested in it, and it's important. So thank you very much.
No, well, man, thank you. It's a labor of love, of course. We will see you soon, I'm sure, my friend.
All right, man. Take care.
Thank you. Appreciate you doing it.
Bye.